Oh. What's up? Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Dustin Singer here, and today we're going to be talking about how to make your footage look cinematic fast. I'm kidding. I couldn't even say that with a straight face. There are so many content creators and YouTubers out there, and full disclosure, I am not hating on anyone. I am simply just going to tell you the truth. I don't use LUTs. I have never purchased any other content creator or filmmakers certain LUT packs to slap on my footage and then I call it cinematic. When it comes to videos and films, there is so much more to cinematography than simply a good color grade. Essentially, that's what a LUT is. You need to understand the basics of this, and I'm sure I'm going to get a lot of hate for this, but I really don't care. I'm going to tell you the truth. LUTs stands for look uptake. Essentially, it's a preset for your color grade, color correction. Now, when a content creator says you can make your footage look cinematic fast by simply applying a LUT and it makes it look cinematic, that's a lie. I'm sorry, bad footage just looks bad. When it comes to cinematic footage, there's a lot more that goes into the process than simply editing in post, slapping on the letterbox, and a good color grade. That's just post. To make footage look cinematic, there's a lot more to consider. There is the framing, the composition, what lens you choose, the lighting, the story, the scene. In order to make something cinematic and powerful, there's a lot more that goes into a scene than simply a good color grade, because if it's just color corrected well, okay, it's just good color correction, but it's not cinematic. So there's a lot of people that need to stop saying you can make your footage look cinematic fast by simply slapping on a LUT and calling it a day. No. You are not a cinematographer, you are not a filmmaker if you're saying that. You need to also say within the same breath that there's a lot more that goes into making great videos and great films than simply good color correction and good editing skills. In full disclosure, I'm not going to be releasing a LUT pack. No, I'm not going to be releasing any presets or LUTs at the end of this video. Hey, by the way, it's on sale, 50% off. Link down in the bio. Buy it. No, I'm not going to be selling that. Instead, I want to teach you and hopefully help you in your own journey, because when you learn how to edit properly, that's good. What's the old expression? Give a man a fish, he can eat for a day. Teach a man to fish, he can eat for life. Instead, I'm going to be sharing the knowledge and some of the lessons of basic editing skills when it comes to color correction. All right, let's go. All right, so here we are in Final Cut. Once you have your footage on your timeline, I have two clips here. One is a portfolio video of a model that I shot in Cape Town, South Africa, and the other one is a shot of me walking in the streets of London, jolly old England. Okay, so the steps in order for color correcting your footage, there are three steps. First is your exposure, second is your white balance, and then third is your specific color grading or coloring for that footage of the specific look that you want it to have. So here we are. Let's work on the first clip, which is a shot of Laura on the coast in Cape Town. Beautiful, cinematic. It is shot in 96 frames per second, shot at golden hours, so the lighting and the color looks awesome straight out of camera. You have Table Mountain behind her, beautiful landscape in the Atlantic Ocean. That looks awesome. So a helpful tip for the first thing that you want to do with color correcting is you want to find what I call the hero clip. Essentially like the most awesome shot of the scene, the one that kind of dominates and the one that you're going to be working on. So if we scrub through, what looks good, what looks awesome, what looks awesome, there, that is awesome. That is a beautiful shot of Laura right there. I'm just going to extend this out a little bit. So this is the point of the clip that you're going to base all of your editing on, because it's kind of the focus. She's looking directly at the camera. This was a portfolio video for her, so this shot is the one that I want to color correct and edit on. So first things first, let's work on our exposure. Up at the top right here, there is your video inspector. Next is your color inspector. This is what we're going to be working on. So as you can see, it says no corrections. Let's add a color wheels. Now what you do is, for your exposure, hit Command 7 on your Mac, and that will bring up the specific waveforms and scopes. Now what I want to do is I want to have a waveform and I want to work on my luma for my exposure. Now essentially what this shows you on the screen here is just dealing with your exposure for this specific shot. So you can see the value is going from 120 represents your highlights, 0 and -20 represents your shadows. So first things first, with our color wheels, let's start correcting the exposure a little bit. So I like to start with my highlights, and easy way to do this to tell how far to go is you just max it right out. See how on the left there it's starting to clip and forms a solid white line along the top of the luma? That's way too overexposed. So we want to bring this down. Essentially the rule is meant to keep it between 100 and 0. Now this is all kind of personal preference depending on the project that you're working on and what the video footage is. It all depends on what you're editing. So in this specific case, I can push this a little bit farther than straight out of camera. So straight out of camera, it's at around that. What I want to do is I want to bring this down a little bit because of I know what I'm going to be editing later on, as I'll show you guys later on. Next, let's bring down our shadows just a touch right about there. And our midtones, let's bring those up ever so slightly. So that's pretty much color correction, or that's pretty much exposure fixing. Next, let's work on the white balance. Now, what white balancing is the relationship between the reds, the greens, and the blues of the footage. Essentially meant to make sure that it's the proper balance of all three of these colors. When these three colors are balanced properly and mixed together properly, it creates pure white. So as you can see on the scopes over here, you open it up and you go to your RGB parade. This gives you the scopes of the red, greens, and blues of the footage. So looking at this, going to the bottom here, you kind of just look and see if it's all lining up properly and balanced properly. As you can see, we got quite a bit of the blues in the midtones and not quite enough in the highlights. And in our shadows, it looks like we got a little bit too much blue and not enough green. So to correct this, go back over to your right hand side of your screen here, beside the color wheels, click on that arrow, and what we're going to do is we're going to add a color curves. Now this opens up the luma. This controls the curves of the RGB, your red, greens, blues, and your luminance of the entire thing. Now if we were to just select luma and bring this down, that brings down the highlights of the entire footage, but we want to focus on just the white balance of this footage. So for this, I want to bring up my blues ever so slightly in the highlights, just a little bit more. It's all about micro adjustments here, guys. It really is. Because if you go too hard with your adjustments, then it just looks too processed. So next, I want to pull down a little bit more green in the shadows, and my midtones, I want to pull a little bit of blue out of my midtone. So I'm going to add a point to my blue and pull that down just slightly, a little bit more. That's a little bit too much. Right about there. And my reds, it looks like I don't have enough red in my midtones here. So I'm going to add a midpoint to my midtones and pull this up ever so slightly. That looks a little bit too much. Just bring that down just a hair. And that looks pretty good to me, just going by eye. If anything, maybe pull a little bit more blue out of that midtones. Right about there, it looks pretty good. Okay, next. Now with the specific coloring, let's go back to our color wheels. Now what you can do is with the footage, to add just more color and vibrance to the image, what you can do is you can just go to your master slider on the right side with all the exposures. With your master, you can bring up the overall exposure of the entire image or bring it down, such as that. And on the left side is your color, essentially your saturation level for each of those wheels. Now with this, the color looks brilliant as is because this was shot at the prime time of shooting, which is golden hour, ladies and gentlemen. Let me tell you something, golden hour in Cape Town is unbelievable. Oh, it's perfect every single day. Oh, I need to go back. So overall, I want to add just a little bit more color to this, just a little bit more saturation. You don't want to go too hard because then it just looks like she has jaundice. She looks like an Oompa Loompa from Willy Wonka. Pull it all the way down, and we're going into a noir black and white, which looks pretty dope, I do have to say. But this is a portfolio video. It all depends on what you're shooting and what the purpose is for the video. The client, it all depends on what you're shooting. Every color correction recipe is going to be different. This is not the be-all end-all color correcting for all footage. We'll be going through that a little bit later in the second clip. So added just a little bit more saturation. Now one thing I like to do with this is I like to go back to my curves and I like to focus on the luma. What I like to do is you can do a lot with your color curves and specifically your luma. You can do a lot to the footage. So what I like to do is I like to create a classic S curve, which is bringing up the highlights. You add 3 points, one in the middle, highlights, and then your shadows. And by creating a slight S curve, it creates quite a bit of contrast and adds just a little bit more depth to the footage, a little bit more punch to it, as I like to say. Another classic thing to do with editing, with color correcting with your luma, with the curve, is taking your shadows point, the lowest point here, and bringing this up, lifting the shadows. If you go too much, you can see on her dress it faded it out quite a bit. That doesn't look that great, and it's also starting to affect her hair and her skin tones. So that's too much. Like I said, guys, it's all about micro adjustments, just slight adjustments, because an image that looks too processed just looks too processed. Now, a helpful tip when editing skin tones and portfolio videos, you want to protect the skin tones and make sure that they look as natural as possible. Now, what you do is, on your luma curve, select the eyedropper and then select the skin tone of your subject. Right there looks like a good spot, and what it does is it shows you the point that is the tones for the skin. Now you want to keep these as natural as possible and looking as best as possible. The rule is that you want to keep that point, that skin tone point of that marker that we made, keep that directly on the diagonal line, because I'll show you what happens. If I were to add another point to that luma right there, and if I were to pull this down, watch her skin tones, watch what happens. See, it's starting to pull all, it's starting to mess up the skin tones. It looks bad. And if I were to go all the way up, it looks like she has lesions on her face. That doesn't look good. So you don't want to do that. You want to protect the skin tones as much as possible, and the rule is with skin tones, they generally lie within the mid-tone section of your luma curve. So if you just keep that in mind when you're editing footage of people and you want to protect those skin tones, make sure that you protect your mid-tones here in the luma curves. There's also a lot more that you can do with skin tones within the reds and the color and the vector scopes, but this is just basics. So overall, I'm pretty happy with how this looks right now. Let's go back to our video inspector, and I'm going to make this bigger. Toggle the effects off and on. Look at how much better that looks. Here it looks a little bit gray, although, like I will say, straight out of camera, that looks awesome. But with color correcting, you want to just add a little bit more to it, just add a little bit more dynamic range. Bam, there is the after. If we're to go back to our color wheels, if you scroll down, you can control the overall temperature of the footage. Now, by default, it is set at 5,000 kelvins. Now, what you can do is if you want to add more warmth to an image, to a video clip, you can take the slider and drag it to the right. See how it's adding a lot more orange, a lot more. It's adding a lot more warm tones to the footage. Since this was shot in like summertime Cape Town, you could add a little bit more, or you could pull some of it out. A lot cooler tone, and with these tones, with the temperature, pardon me, with adjusting the temperature, this conveys a lot of emotion, a lot of feeling from videos. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're sliding this temperature slider all over the place. Way too blue, it just looks iced out. Way too red, or way too much into the yellow, and it's, yeah, doesn't look that great. It's all about micro adjustments here, guys. So if we're to leave this at the 5,000 range mark, that's kind of straight out of camera. I want to add a little bit more warmth to it since it was shot at sunset. Let's go with around 5,500. Looks pretty good. So go back to our video inspector, toggle my effects on and off, and that looks great. It looks like she has a beautiful tan and the lovely golden hour that Cape Town has. And you can tell by with that S-curve that we made, it just adds a nice level of contrast between the details of the rocks and the ocean and her, between the darks and the highlights of the video. And that looks awesome. Very happy with that. Okay, moving on to the next clip. This is a shot that I set up in London. It's just a simple shot of me walking away from my camera. Go through the steps again. First thing we're going to do is fix our exposure. Bring up my Luma waveform once again, and let's fix this exposure. As you can tell from this footage, it looks very washed out and gray tone. That's because this was shot in a log format. So let's bring up our highlights once again. Pull down our shadows, add a little bit more contrast to that. That's starting to look nice. That's starting to look good. The blacks are starting to look the way they're supposed to. And let's pull down our midtones a little bit. Let's add a little bit of depth to this. Overall, I am happy with that exposure. Next, let's fix our white balance for this footage. So over here, gonna swap from the Luma over to the RGB Parade. Overall, this looks pretty damn good, I must say. This white balance, I white balanced this shot pretty well while I was shooting. So if anything, specifically, I might just pull a little bit of blue out. Now, let's go back to our color wheels and let's start adding some saturation back into this. So I just want to lift up my master just a little bit. Let's add a little bit to my highlights, a bit more color to my shadows, and just a bit in my midtones. Next, let's go back to our color curves and let's add a little bit of detail and get some character from this shot, shall we? So once again, I'm going to create a nice little S-curve. This is super poor man's process editing, guys. I just want to show you the basics and the 3 things you need to focus on when it comes to editing. So as you can see from that S-curve, that added a lot of detail. Let's toggle that. That's on, that's off, that's on, that's off. That's looking pretty nice. I want to lift up my blacks ever so slightly, but I'm going to add another point here. Pull those shadows back down. That's looking nice. This was shot in summertime. This was shot in May, I believe, when I was in London. And overall temperature of this shot is looking pretty good. It's pretty balanced. I want to add a little bit more warmth to this. I want around there. Looks pretty good. 5,800. That looks pretty good. It adds quite a bit of warmth. Now, another thing with color correcting to get a specific feel and a specific look for your color tones. For this, what I want to do is I'm going to look at my highlights wheel and I'm going to just pull the color of the highlights into the orange. Maybe a little bit more into there. I'm just dragging and pulling that up. My shadows, I want to pull that down into more of a teal look. I could just go classic. A teal and orange look looks nice. Maybe pull a bit of my saturation down, my overall saturation as well. I got too much saturation in the highlights. And as I can see from this, it's looking too yellow. I want to pull that temperature back down. It's all about micro adjustments. You're going to be going back and forth with your edits, tweaking little things to make it look a specific way. This kind of has a nice little faded out look to it. Overall, I want to pull my shadows down a little bit more. I want to go back to my color curves. What I want to do is I want to pull that blacks down just a little bit more. Pull that down ever so slightly. It's pretty. Sometimes I like to make my footage look a little bit crushed. Midtones, I might pull this up just a bit. Let's see how that looks. That's a little bit too much. Pull up my highlights. pull these ones down slightly. Overall, let's see how this looks. This is where we started, very gray, very washed out, and then after, that looks pretty dang good to me. That looks nice. I like the way that looks. Overall, I'm happy with how that looks. This is a very quick edit for the sake of this tutorial, guys. When you are color correcting your footage, be sure to spend a lot of time on it to get it to look just how you want it and make it look the best. Back to the first clip here. That looks gorgeous, absolutely beautiful with the colors and the warm tones. That looks nice. That looks beautiful. I've had a couple of cups of coffee throughout the making of this video. So, as you learned, color correction, it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of little adjustments, minor adjustments. Making your footage look good fast, there is no fast, quick fix. I think that's probably why a lot of people, why it's so appealing, and so it's really just good advertising when people say, hey, you can make your footage look cinematic fast. Because let's all be honest here, humans are lazy by nature. We want to take the path of the least resistance, the easiest way to do it. I hope you found this tutorial a little bit helpful. I hope that you guys learn how to color correct properly and practice a lot more, and don't call yourself a cinematographer if you're just slapping on a LUT. I'm sorry, you're not. Color correction is a skill. It takes a lot of practice. I was not an expert. I am not saying that I am an expert in color correction, but I have learned a thing or two, and I hope you guys found this tutorial helpful. These are some of the basic things in color correction. Keep practicing. You guys will improve, and I'm sure your videos will look awesome after you apply all the things that we just talked about. Or at least people will look at it and say, that was a good color. That looks good. That's a good edit. It looks way better than when we shot it in camera. It looks better than straight out of camera. You color corrected that properly. Good job. Boom. Fist bump. Alright guys. Subscribe if you're awesome. Hit that thumbs up if you're wicked cool. And I will see you guys in the next video. Have a good one. I got a video. I gotta finish. I gotta color correct. Later. I need more coffee. Later guys.